So I'm going to just sort of lay out a couple of points. It's going to be quite quick and hopefully very focused on a structure of how we might go about doing some things in the future. So I've just got 2 slides. You must love that. And we'll get to them right now. Where is it? So, no, this is the wrong presentation. Okay, well, let's just go with that then. And I'll do my best to get through this. This one's got 8 slides. Okay, so what kind of transitions are we looking at here? We're looking, right now we've been talking about the transition in the energy sector being focused on low carbon. But in all the discussions we've been having, we haven't been talking about the other transitions that seem to be happening in the energy sector as well. So when we're talking about trust and transition, we have to make sure we're covering all our bases. So we've talked about low carbon, and low carbon is really a focus on the supply side of the equation to try and move away from fossil fuels towards non-emitting or clean electricity in a lot of our cases. But there's actually 2 other major changes that are happening with the energy systems. We're being more democratic about the way we provide services. That means that smaller organizations and individuals can start to provide these services right at the demand center. And we're also looking at a change towards automation and artificial intelligence, which can really make a significant impact on all of our business processes, and in particular, what it means for labor. So when we talk about the transition to a lower carbon economy, it's not the only thing that's happening. And therefore, we have to look at these things with a little bit of a broader view. Trust. There was 3 points I wanted to relate to here. Relate to trust. There was a survey done by Dylan Jones when he was the president of the Canada West Foundation, just before he moved on to his current role. And in that survey, he showed the disconnect between people and companies, and it all related to trust. And it had everything to do with how the companies were talking to the people and explaining to them that, trust us, we're providing all these economic benefits to the country. And if you looked at how communities saw trust being developed by organizations or individuals coming to them, it was all about community service. So when we're talking about trust and we're talking about credibility, it's very important to be speaking the language that the people who are listening want to receive. And we had some comments yesterday in terms of whether or not governments are trusted. There was some information that came out of the survey from Nick Nanos about trust. Siri did a survey as well. Governments were actually the least trusted of all the organizations that we identified. They were at 17%. Industry associations were in the 30 to 40% range. Academics and energy experts were in the 50% range. And government agencies were 67%. Those were the highest. So, you know, when you're looking at trust, you'll have to look at what the message is and where the message is coming from. A couple other points that are on that chart there relate to knowledge. We've gotten to a point in this country where we are expected at all levels to take into account traditional knowledge. Yet most of us come up through a very scientific-based education system. So when we look at the information that's coming from traditional sources from indigenous peoples, we don't have the right context. So how do we bring that traditional knowledge into a more scientific framework? We're going to have to do it. How's it going to be done? Do we assign some principles of observation and repetition to some of the points that are raised from sources of this traditional knowledge? Or do we take it on faith that some of the elements that they're talking about that may affect a project are true and we should be carrying on with that? I'll end off with this slide. And this is really the framework that I mentioned to my fellow panel members. And that is, it's a concentric circles of things we need to worry about. So right in the middle, we have facts and myths. And what we should be trying to do is deal with the facts and avoid the myths. And a couple of examples related to that. One is pipeline safety, and another one is the safety of vaccines. And so let's just take the safety of vaccines. We have a myth going around that vaccines create or cause autism. Yet if you look at the scientific literature and the original source of that concern, it all shows the opposite, that vaccinations don't create autism, and yet still it exists as a significant concern for some parents. So how can you come up to some sort of compromise on a vaccination policy where you have some people think that if you stick that needle into my child, you're going to permanently harm them? If we're all trying to get into a situation where we're looking for compromise and a way forward where the majority can support that, that's definitely a fact that you have to bring to the table. At the next level, you're talking about systems versus issues. And here's when we get into the politics of making decisions, because it's a lot easier to make decisions about a particular issue. We're going to close down that coal plant, as opposed to we're going to green our electricity system. An example of that is if we look at electrification and we consider the fact that we want to move people towards electric cars. There's a significant opportunity there to turn all those electric cars into autonomous vehicles. And there's a couple of unintended consequences that could come out of that. First of all, if you make it easier for people to drive a individual car because they don't have to drive because they're just being chauffeured around, we'll get more cars on the road. And they won't go into public transit. Our public transit system is already in a state of stress, financial stress on a regular basis across the country. And we're going to increase that stress by moving people out of that system into their own vehicles. The other thing to keep in mind is if we move people into electric vehicles, what is it going to mean for the electricity system? Siri did a study last year looking at the impacts on electricity demand if we move towards electric vehicles and electricity in homes and buildings. You would have to double or triple the size of our electricity grid to serve that demand. So, we may get away with reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but there's other environmental impacts that are surely going to be affected if we double or triple the size of our electricity grid. Unintended consequences. Electrification mean that we wouldn't need service stations anymore. It's 130,000 people in this country that work in service stations. These are entry-level jobs. They're the start of their working career. 130,000 people. If we're plugging in at home, we don't need to go to a service station. What happens with them? What happens with the $10 billion in fuel taxes that go to provinces and the federal government? Are we going to tax our electricity system now? Unintended consequences. And then at the very highest level, we have this conflict between seeking the objective or talking about our values. And we've talked about that a lot as well. And in this case, it really has to bring in people who aren't on the analytical side. We're talking about politicians and even some lady, I think there's a lady yesterday talking about artists and poets and things like that. We need to be able to find a language where we can actually communicate our values in a way that allows other people to understand. I, for one, find it very difficult to communicate my values. If you give me some numbers in a spreadsheet, I'll make it sing and dance. You ask me how I'm feeling, I'm just going to collapse on the floor, right? So, but all these different levels have to go into the overall decision-making process. If you miss one of those, you haven't got a holistic process. So we need some sort of framework where we can engender trust at the facts, the systems, and the value level in order to make better decisions for us all. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.